Vikings. What do you imagine when hearing that word? Hopefully nothing with horned helmets. But either way, I've no doubt that popular culture has shaped the image your mind is making right now. So perhaps you're imagining Marvel's Thor, or Travis Fimmel from History Channel's Vikings, or even Eivor from Assassin's Creed Valhalla. At the very least, you're probably thinking about bearded, axe-wielding warriors wreaking havoc from dragon-like ships. I'd be lying if I said that's not what I imagined them to be at first, thanks in part to Skyrim. Yet, if you stick around, you'll learn that those so-called Vikings weren't only about brawn and braided beards. The image of Vikings in modern media is fairly consistent, yet the reality is, of course, much more complex. But that's exactly what makes learning their history more worthwhile, isn't it? Like every guest in this hall, the real Vikings varied significantly from one individual to the next. And like every culture and society today, theirs was never static or singular, changing over time as they increasingly interacted with other parts of the world. The stereotypical image of the Vikings today, then, is but a sliver of historical truth generously mixed with our own selfish romanticization. Occasionally, this course will reinforce that image, but more often than not, it will challenge and expand upon the idealized Vikings of our imaginations. For starters, the word Viking itself is actually pretty misleading. Despite its common misuse in English today, it's not actually an ethnic term for medieval Scandinavians, and it never was either. The word comes from Old Norse, the language spoken by most of medieval Scandinavia, and it was Vikingur when applied to people. They knew and used the term themselves, but not as an identity for their people or their culture. On the contrary, it was a term they used to describe a person who engaged in a specific type of activity. I'm sure you can guess which activity that was, but the definition of Vikingur can provide some clues if you're not sure. It meant freebooter, sea rover, or pirate. In other words, they only used the term to describe someone who went Viking, which was one expression they'd use for a person who went on a raid. This means that, historically speaking, the term was actually more like a job title. But even then, it was primarily a seasonal, part-time job undertaken by a relatively small portion of the population. Those individuals weren't necessarily warriors with combat experience, but rather young, unmarried men, typically, looking for some quick cash to help start their own farm and family. Yet, even so, raiding parties, Vikingar, often included women, whether they fought or not. That said, it's also misleading to assume that the word Vikingur only applied to Scandinavians. At the very least, the term was also used to refer to raiders from the southern shores of the Baltic, such as the Slavic Wends. But it's clear that Vikingar included people from all across Scandinavia, the regions surrounding it, and further abroad. Medieval Scandinavia was, after all, a multi-ethnic place where the majority population of Norse mingled with Sami, Finns, Slavs, and more. The very notion of a pure Norse people would have baffled them, and it's nonsense to impose such frivolous purity onto them in the first place. The reality of this multi-ethnic medieval Scandinavia and its diaspora, if you somehow still doubt me, has been confirmed by a large genetic study published in 2020. It's not, therefore, the wishful thinking of a liberal agenda. It's historical fact, supported by human behavior and scientific evidence. This doesn't mean that our stereotypical image of a fair-skinned, bearded Viking wasn't commonplace, but rather that not all Vikingar actually fit that description, nor were they expected to. The next major misconception, then, is their reputation for violence. In the medieval period, the word Vikingur wasn't always associated with violence, and the idea that Vikingar were somehow more violent than their fellow contemporaries is one that developed in the records of their victims and in the centuries following their raids. In reality, They were just violent people living in violent times. Their methods and ambitions weren't actually that different from other early medieval people, including Christian rulers like Charlemagne. For example, Vikingar executed 111 prisoners in 845, but Charlemagne ordered the decapitation of 4,500 Saxons from Saxony, Germany, that is, not England, during the winter of 784 to 85. As the ruler of a large kingdom with a well-organized army, it's no wonder that Charlemagne was able to inflict more violence than the relatively small, unorganized raiding parties that were descending from the north in the same period. And yet, it's the Vikingar, and not Charlemagne, who ended up with a reputation for barbarism and senseless violence. Why? Because the victims of the Vikingar had a monopoly on writing, and thus shaped the historical record to their sympathies. Charlemagne, on the other hand, had writers of his own. They produced sources like the Royal Frankish Annals, which take pride in the devastating violence their king inflicted upon their enemies. Although there was a vibrant oral tradition in the north, no one glorified the violence of the Vikingar in the written record as it unfolded. Instead, their victims flooded the record with expressions of horror and calamity. Lo, it is nearly 350 years that we and our fathers have inhabited this most lovely land, and never before has such terror appeared in Britain as we have now suffered from a pagan race. Nor was it thought that such an inroad from the sea could be made. Behold, the church of St. Cuthbert, splattered with the blood of the priests of God, despoiled of its ornaments. A place more venerable than all in Britain is given as prey to pagan peoples, and where first, after the departure of St. Paulius from York, the Christian religion in our race took its rise, there misery and calamity have begun. Who does not fear this? Who does not lament this as if his country were captured? Foxes pillage the chosen vine. The heritage of the Lord has been given to the Gentiles. The holy festivity has been turned to mourning. Lucky for us, though, we don't actually have to rely solely on those written records. We can approach the history of the Vikingar through the things they left behind, that is, material culture, the landscapes they altered, as in burial mounds, fortifications, etc., genetic and isotopic studies, you know, that fancy science stuff, runic inscriptions, and, cautiously, the literature written by their own descendants, the infamous sagas. Why infamous? Well, as historical sources, they're tricky to use for this course, because they were written centuries after the time of the Vikingar by their Christianized, mostly Icelandic descendants. I think the best way to summarize the problem is like this. They record genuine historical memory, but that memory was shaped by the demands and conditions of its present. So while those sagas are known for their historical truths, for they do contain some, they were written to be relevant and useful for their own contemporary audiences, meaning they more accurately reflect the later medieval period, rather than the time of the Vikingar themselves. Nevertheless, when used responsibly, alongside the other source material that's available to us, they can still provide valuable insights. That said, I'll be using them in conversation with other sources throughout this course when it's appropriate. If you're concerned about that, my own academic training and the work of this field's top scholars will be serving as my framework for doing so. By the end of this course, you'll learn that the stereotypical Viking of our modern imaginations hardly encapsulates the true complexity and diversity of the Vikingar. They weren't just a bunch of bloodthirsty, bearded warriors. They were also farmers, artisans, poets, merchants, explorers, and settlers. Yes, some of them were violent and fearsome warriors, but, as a whole, they were so much more than that.